Here we go. Good. Okay.
Welcome, everybody. This is Brant Cooper from News the Needle. You've joined Lean Lunch. We're very pleased to have as our guest this week Alistair Croll, author of Lean Analytics, one of the original thought leaders in Lean Startup. Obviously helping startups with this Lean Startup stuff too, but moving as a lot of us are into the enterprise and trying to help jumpstart innovation inside of large enterprises. Welcome, Alistair.
Thanks, Brent. Good to be here.
Yeah, good to have you. So why don't you, if you could real quick, maybe give a little story, give a background on yourself and what you've been up to the last couple of years and how you got where you are.
Sure. So I've got a storied background in like running bulletin boards as a kid and taking business courses. Did a few startups, one of them called Coradient, which did web performance monitoring, and was part of the founding team there, and then that was bought by BMC in 2011. Since that time, I ran a startup accelerator in Montreal, where I live. We do a lot of stuff in the tech community here, and that accelerator was called Year One Labs. And my co-author, Ben Yoskowitz, who writes Instigator blog, which is a great blog on innovation, he and I wrote this book, Lean Analytics, for O'Reilly. It's part of a series that O'Reilly published in conjunction with Eric Ries, and it tries to sort of dive a little deeper into the different aspects. So in the Lean startup, you have the build, measure, learn cycle. That part about measuring and learning is really something that a lot of people neglect. Everyone loves to build things, but then they kind of forget that the measuring and learning is the whole point, right? And you're not building a product, you're building a product to figure out what product to build. And so Ben and I took our learnings from Year One Labs, and one of the things that we found hardest was we had no idea what normal was. And this seemed to be like a systemic problem. People would go, my churn is at 7%. They'd have no idea whether that was good or bad for their business model, for their stage of growth. And so we just, because we're shameless, we basically asked a lot of people. We probably talked to 150 founders, VCs, analysts, investors, and asked them what they thought normal was. And it turns out when you ask enough people, you can draw a line in the sand for many of these metrics. And so Lean Analytics is sort of a more prescriptive complement to Lean Startup. It says, this is the metric you should watch at this stage. Don't do anything until you get to this number. And here's how to experiment with that number and how to capture those metrics. We've been pleasantly surprised by the reception. I think people were looking for a concrete book, so it's being translated into 9 languages now. And ever since the book came out, most of the calls we get are big companies going, hey, I know what metrics are. Can we do this too? And that's made for a fascinating year.
Yeah, that's awesome. It's funny you mentioned that last thing. I've got a new book collaboration coming out this summer called Lean Brand, and I talk to these large enterprises and I say, oh yeah, we do Lean Startup stuff, and they go, oh, well, we're not a startup. And then I've got my book Lean Entrepreneur. I talk to them about Lean Entrepreneur. We're not entrepreneurs. We don't have. I go, yeah, I got this new book coming out, Lean Brand, and they're like, oh, yeah, brand, we've got one of those. So
yeah, it's weird. I mean, the thing that the latest project that I've been working on is this project called Tilt the Windmill, and that came from because we're analysts. I know which lines people highlight in the book when they read the ebook, and so for example, when we have people read the book, the number one quoted line is if it won't change your behavior, it's a bad metric. We love that line, but the second most quoted line is being an entrepreneur is like tilting at windmills, right? And from our point of view, it's kind of feudal, like Don Quixote. You get this big machine you're trying to change. So I came up with Tilt the Windmill because that's a popular line, but also, frankly, because tilting at windmills is like SEO unfriendly. But I also kind of liked the analogy of tilt. Like when you're using a pinball machine, it's set up a certain way, and it has these built-in checks to make sure that if you try to do something you're not supposed to with the machine, it like shuts down. And so many businesses I work with, that's the problem, right? You try to do something the machine isn't designed to do, it shuts down. And businesses, Steve Blank famously said, a startup is an organization designed to search for a sustainable, repeatable business model. What people forget is that the corollary of that is a large enterprise is an organization designed to perpetuate a sustainable, repeatable business model. It must be by definition, right? So if part of your business is not, of your large company is focused on not perpetuating the existing business but finding a new one, they are by definition a startup. They're just doing it in an incredibly hostile environment that has like an immune system designed to suppress these things. And I think people like us, when we go into these organizations, we're often like antihistamines. We go in and try and teach the organization not to react when this new thing comes into the immune system. You know?
I love the immune system analogy. What really got you interested? I mean, how did you first discover the power of lean startup? What was it that triggered you?
Well, I mean, Coradiant took 10 years to figure out what it was going to build. We started out as a managed service provider, and we moved into the appliance space to make an appliance that would watch web traffic and understand performance. And we changed the product from we will run your website for you to here's a tool that'll tell you where it's broken. And we changed the customer. We switched from the operators to the web analysts and the marketing people. But it took me like 7 years to learn how to say the following words. Analytics shows you what people are doing. We show you if they can do it. Like, that's an incredibly simple statement that took me 7 years to figure out how to say. And after 7 years, like LinkedIn, Salesforce, Fidelity all bought one, and my sales pitch became LinkedIn, Salesforce, and Fidelity all bought one. Would you like one? Right? Like, product market fit just sucks the demand right out of your hands. It's amazing, but it takes that epiphany of finding the right product with the right market and the right message, and it took us a long time to find that. And I think so. I was a real convert for that. And then since Coradiant, I've been running a lot of conferences, talking to a lot of startups. I'm an advisor at Founder Fuel, which is a startup accelerator in Montreal, and I run an event called Startup Fest, which actually happens in 2 weeks' time in Montreal. So I'd been talking to a lot of these people, and time and again, you could hear that the people they had a great idea, but they were stuck inside one particular framing of the business, and it took someone who was outside that to sort of help them reframe it. And so I'm fascinated with systematic ways to reframe things. So I'll tell you a great example of this that came up last week. I was at the Highway 1 launch party, demo day. So Highway 1 is a hardware accelerator. It's part of PCH. PCH is the largest provider of like supply logistics out of Shenzhen. So they handle all of Apple's supply out of Shenzhen. And they have a startup accelerator called Highway 1. And Highway 1 was showcasing a bunch of its recent graduates and its new cohorts. And one of the things they were showcasing was a company called Q, C-U-E. You may have seen this. Q lets you take like a swab of your throat or your mouth, put it in a little incubation device. Within about 15 minutes, it tells you if you have the flu. It's cool, right? And so everyone's talking about this is great because now you can get a flu diagnosis in 5 minutes, 10 minutes. I'm fascinated by the unintended consequences of things. And so this is one of the things I like about Lean Startup is it forces you to look at the unintended consequences. So in the case of Q, if I say the sentence to you, you can find it if you have the flu in 10 minutes. One of my favorite mental tricks for entrepreneurs and large organizations to get people thinking about innovation is to replace can with must. So in that sentence, you must get a flu diagnosis in 15 minutes. You can envision a world where if this technology is successful, you won't be able to take your kids on a field trip to school until you have a flu swab that is less than 12 hours old, right? People don't think about and then, you know, parents are like swabbing themselves to get their kid to go on the field trip, and then there's a lawsuit because someone got the flu. I love that sort of perverse take on the world where you take someone tells you about a can and you say to yourself, well, if that can becomes a must, what are the consequences of society? You can drive an electric car. You must drive an electric car. What are the consequences? And many enterprises, I find that's a great way to get the juices flowing is to look at anything that is a can and what happens if it becomes a must. What happens to your existing market, product, and so on.
Do you have any good examples of where you've done that and it's led to either a new innovation or stopping down a path because the unintended consequences were too daunting?
Yeah, so I have a lot of examples, but I'm not allowed to talk about most of them. That's the downside of doing a lot of the intrapreneur stuff. I have been doing a series of interviews with Tilt the Windmill and interviewing different people, probably about 20 so far, some from big companies, some from less big companies. I'll give you one example that I haven't written up yet and probably should. So I talked to Gary Hoberman, who is one of the 3 CIOs at MetLife. MetLife's a big, boring insurance company, right? I mean, they do life insurance. So Gary's been so first of all, MetLife's CEO has this policy where if you cut $10 out, you get $6.66 back. So instead of saying it's a cost-cutting mechanism, they say, look, if you want to invest in a new idea, go cut some money, and that's how you get your funding. So it's first of all, it's a great way to say, you want funding for a project, go make something more efficient. Now, Gary has a project that they built called Infinity. And it's available on the U.S. App Store. I haven't got an update on how it's going. When I talked to him last fall, it was going pretty well. And so Gary realized that one of the things that we might consider a reframing of the insurance company is the curator of our legacy. I mean, right now, an insurance company pays out when you die. That's about it, right? They show up and they decide, yes, you're legally dead, and these are the people you're supposed to give stuff to, and they handle that. But he realized that if you reframe that particular model as you get the life insurance company is the curator of your digital legacy, then it can be like an app that's sort of like a life locker, and when you die, it sends your wife a note saying, thank you, I love you. And he has this heartbreaking example of like the things that are, he's got a screenshot of the things that are triggered when you die, and it's like a photo of our first vacation together, a note for you, my love, saying goodbye, all my bank accounts and passwords. And I'm like, every time I see this slide, I'm like tearing up. And then I realize I'm kind of okay with a life insurance company doing that. Like, maybe that is what they're for, you know? So I love those examples where if you step way back and say, we're in the business of doing something after you die, right? There's a trust model for a life insurance company doing something after you die. What happens after you die? What are the new opportunities that have happened after you die? And then how can those be applied? And in this case, I mean, it's an experiment, but the cost of running that experiment is tiny, you know, compared to some other marketing thing. Try that out. See if people bite. I'll give you one more quick example. So I talked to DHL last year. I was at their innovation conference, and they told me that this is DHL, you know, big multi-billion-dollar logistics company. It said rather than trying to get money for a startup, they ask for money to study something, and then the way they study it is they start something. So if you were to ask Nielsen to do a worldwide survey on something, it's going to cost you $500,000. That'll fund 10 startups. So many people came to them a few years ago and said, oh, 3D printing is going to kill you guys because it's going to mean that people ship their stuff around the world, and all people are shipping is like, all people are going to spend their time shipping is plastic to print things out. And so they said, well, is this true? Is this really going to happen? Or is 3D printing not that big a deal? Well, the best way to find out is to go start a 3D printing company. So they didn't say that. They said, we'd like money to study the 3D printing industry. And the way they studied it was by starting a small 3D printing company. A few $100,000 later, they're like, hey, we know this is not going to kill our business. We know there's these obstacles. By the way, we'll even create a study on the 3D printing industry now that we know it really well. Use that study with our suppliers and our customers to show them what the market's going to be like. And now we're incredibly informed. When shareholders say 3D printing is going to kill you, actually, here's our really good study. Because who's better to write a study on 3D printing than someone who's failed in that industry? So simply saying, I am doing a study on 3D printing, and then actually, you know, behind people's backs going, and that study happens to be a startup, is a great way to do it. Because you either say, good news, I have our study and it's not an interesting market, or you say, good news, I have a study, it is an interesting market, and by the way, I created a startup.
So are you normally working with companies that are already partly down the path, or are they looking for, hey, how do we do this at all? I mean, what's sort of the impetus for them to reach out to you guys?
So I think the first impetus is sheer raw terror. They and you know, and all praise to Eric for doing the GE thing, because now I have the perfect answer when they say, yeah, but we're not a startup. I'm like, neither is GE. Read this, right? But the first thing that triggers the conversation is, hey guys, we are desperate to understand how we might be disintermediated. So in many cases, it starts with like a competitive analysis. There's someone doing competitive analyst stuff, and they see so many startups coming up, and they see the erosion of traditional barriers to entry. The tagline for this Tilt the Windmill project is cycle time trumps scale. And so in the past, scale was this huge barrier to entry, right? If you Michael Porter's 5 Forces, Porter said the only sustainable competitive advantage is scale. These days, it may be scale, but it's scale of attention. Like Facebook and Amazon and Google have your attention, so it's a different kind of scale. But traditional scale, like owning the means of production, owning the capital, owning the employment, owning the labor legislation, those traditional forms of scale don't work so well anymore because the barriers to entry are so low, and they've been so disrupted. And if you really step back, the reason the barriers to entry have been disrupted is that we can now do almost everything in a batch of one. Like when the economic order quantity drops to 1, the cost of the prototype is the same as the cost of the product. And that transforms, and that's a very broad statement that will take 20 years to manifest itself. But I think if you, at the root of all of this enterprise transformation, that the shortening lifespan of the Fortune 500 company, it's because the economic order quantity is sliding towards 1. So they realize this. They may not realize it in those words, but they realize that there's an eroded barrier to entry, that maybe products are not maintained. It's getting harder and harder to maintain a cash cow because market externalities and efficiencies take that over. It's becoming very difficult for a whole bunch of reasons for them to properly sustain a market and recoup the initial investment. And so as a result, I think they're coming to this. Some department is coming to this. Sometimes it's HR, sometimes it's marketing, sometimes it's operations. But they're all trying to find ways of experimenting better.
And so, do they tend to have existing projects that they want you to help on, or is it just sort of wide open? How are you going to teach some of our teams to do this? Is a combination? I'm kind of curious what you come in and you bring this. I know you can do anything in Lean Startup, but you have, at least from your book, sort of this analytics angle. And so I'm kind of curious whether you kind of dive into that right away, like let's look at your existing projects and get you to focus on the right metrics, or is it sort of more, even more beginner than that?
So most of the time, my first engagement with people has been working with our product teams. So I've had companies bring 300 product managers from around the world. Ben and I were in Barcelona for that recently. I've had people say, come in and train this government agency spend 2 days with us, and it's like 30 people. The ones that are not really understanding this, my usual process is in Lean Analytics, we have these systems diagrams that show how a business model works. So big box at the top, here come all the users, and then there's a conversion funnel, and then there's sort of churn processes, and there's reactivation. So just teaching people how to draw that diagram, like just show me your business as a diagram, is like a 2-hour exercise, and at the end of it they go, oh my, there's like an epiphany. I know how to draw an idea. And this seems stupid, right? But just showing people how to draw an idea as a bunch of blocks and arrows is huge. Once you've done that, they realize that those blocks and arrows are actually the first column in a business model, because they're all your assumptions, right? I will get 700 visitors a day and 50% of them will do this, or I will sell 25 fridges a day and 13 will get RMA'd, or whatever. That's really your business model. You just draw that diagram. And I always think that a business plan kind of sucks, because a business plan is just your business model if you just drag it to the right. Like if the business model is properly done as a spreadsheet, you should be able to go in Excel and like select the first row, drag to the right, and it'll just tell you your business plan. And like it's already there. It just materializes as you drag to the right. And like quite literally, if you've done your business model right with one column, you could drag that to the right and it automatically fills in. So teaching them how to draw this diagram is good. And then I go, okay, great, you've done the diagram, and there's a lot of gnashing of teeth, and in some cases the teams are arguing over things they all thought was the same. So first step is getting them on the same page and just describing their business as a picture, right? A really dumb skill, and people tell me this is like the most useful thing. At the end of that, maybe first 2 hours, I say, okay, you've got these arrows between boxes. What is the metric that shows you that arrow? So page view, page visit to sign up would be like an engagement or an activation. Sign up to purchase would be a conversion. Purchase to going away would be a churn. Just give the labels to the arrows. So these are metrics, but that's the number you want to track. So that takes another maybe half hour. Now they got this box diagram with these arrows, and I say, okay, what is the metric you'd like to have for your business model? Well, they should know this from their assumption, right? A churn needs to be below 2%. We need to see 5,000 views a day, whatever that activity is. And I'm using web-centric terms, but this applies just as well to people, buying stuff in a storefront. And then another hour goes by, and they argue about, what this needs to be. But if they don't know, they say, well, how do you tell? I said, well, it should be in your business plan. Like you should have an assumption your business model that you need a certain number of conversions, and if your visits are lower, then your conversion rate has to be higher, and so on. If you don't have those numbers, the best thing to do is go like open our book and find out what normal is according to the people we asked, but expect it to change. So that's another hour. And then at the last hour, I go, okay, no, where are you? And they're like, what do you mean? Well, what are those numbers today? I don't know. Shouldn't you probably go figure that out? And so at the end of the day, they're like, we just drew a box, but we have this box that describes our business, shows the metrics we care about, shows what they need to be, shows what they are, and now I can find which ones are on fire. And I'm like, well, what do you want to work on? And they immediately go, that one, the one that's like flaming red. Okay, call me when you want to talk next, right? I'm being a little facetious. There's more discussion around it, but that process of those few meetings invariably leads to incredible value and not a lot of complication. Like that's a fairly straightforward set of meetings, right? And it's amazing that people haven't, like, to me this is like writing or arithmetic. It's a fundamental skill that you should be taught if you're in business, and for some reason it seems to be not a very common skill.
Right. Well, I think it goes back to what you were saying earlier. The businesses are optimized for executing in these known markets, and so that's not a normal skill set, the one you're talking about when you're executing on these known processes in a known market. And I love the simplicity of it, though, because it really, in the end, it's pretty simple what you ought to be working on. I mean, I think that it's just hard for large enterprises to boil it back down to a small market segment, and here's the one or two metrics that you need to be concentrating on today. Once you figure it out, you'll have to move on. You'll have to get mired in this, it's business intelligence. They get mired in the quantity of data that they have to look at, as well as the quantity of customers that they have to look at, rather than going, well, this is a new value proposition that we're trying to establish here. We need to narrow it back down both to a few customers, but also just to a few data points.
Yeah, one of the things, so we have this line in the book, the one metric that matters, right? And the people often object that, I can't just run one metric. And I'm like, well, you can when you're parking a car. The only metric that matters is how far are you from the thing behind you. Like your gas light comes on, you're going to stop and see what's wrong, right? But the only metric that matters is how far you are from the, and they say, well, that's great for a startup. But in a big company, I can't possibly do that. And the answer is, and we have Donald Rumsfeld to thank for this, he said, we have known unknowns, we have unknown knowns, and all that stuff. And so known knowns are the facts. And you probably should check on them because you're probably wrong, but fair enough, they're facts. Unknown knowns are your tacit knowledge. As a founder or a department head, you may have a lot of information you're not communicating properly. So that's all about proper communication of the assumptions and the underlying goals to the employees. Known unknowns are reporting. And so if I have a bunch of known unknowns, like what were sales today? I know I don't know what sales were, but I need to go find them out. So that's a known unknown, right? If I have a known unknown, just give me the known unknown sales and give me a report, and I can manage that by exception. Like if it's 20% higher or lower than yesterday, call me. Otherwise, shut the hell up. And so it's the unknown unknowns, the exploratory ones, that are where the insight comes from. Because a company or a large organization is an organization designed to perpetuate a sustainable, repeatable business model, I think the reason people don't know about how to draw a diagram is the diagram for their business model is called their org chart. It's called their set of reports. Like it's already so entrenched in the world, they don't realize they're living in a box diagram. And so it never occurs to them to sort of draw the box diagram because that's the world they live in. But I think saying to people, look, when you try and innovate, you have to look at unknown unknowns. Your known unknowns are reports, and they're great, but they should be managed by exception. And most analysts, I had a conversation with an analyst at a client last week, I can't say who, but she was very frustrated that people keep asking her for reports. And she said, it's like whack-a-mole. They go, what about this? Can you show me this? Oh, can you slice it by this? And the reality is that she hates that whack-a-mole thing. So I said to her, well, what would you like to go do? And she went off of her own accord. She went and looked at their website. This is not a traditional tech company. She went and looked at their website. She found out the top search terms, just open-ended, what are people searching for? Of those, what are people searching for and finding very little? What is the rate of change of those search terms compared to Google Trends? So some of those search terms are declining month over month. One of them was increasing month over month on Google trends and decreasing on their site. And she's like, whoa, that's already weird, right? That's a very exploratory thing. Nobody asked her. And then because of this, she went and dug into it, and she found out that there's like a huge need for more content on this particular topic. They're not promoting it properly. All the calls to action are broken. And now they can completely overhaul this thing. That's not something someone would have said, go and compare. She sort of sat down and said, let's see what people are asking that we're not properly responding to, which is trending opposite where the world is trending, because that's an interesting place to hunt.
So interesting. Yeah. So let me ask you this. This is like one of, obviously, often the most asked question whenever we do these type of things, or even on these webinars with Eric. How does an individual inside of a large enterprise get started? So they consider themselves entrepreneurial. Clearly, their bosses don't get it. They're getting measured based on going to be able to start producing new revenue, and that revenue has to be significant enough for anybody inside this large enterprise to care. So what is the individual who actually wants to make this sort of change in the organization? What's a good first step?
Have permission. That's probably the first best step. We joke that the difference between a special operative and a rogue agent is permission.
Yeah, that's funny because we say exactly the opposite. Don't wait for permission.
Yeah. So you asked what the best first step is. The best first step is to have permission. I didn't say what the most likely first step was. So it's extremely unlikely that you have permission. You probably need to look at a business function, hiring, writing a tagline, whatever, and figure out how to run an experiment. Like, to me, experimentation is the heart of data-driven innovation, because if I run an experiment, I can then say to someone, hey, of the 3 things I was told to do, this is the one that works best. So it's within the purview of my job and so on, and no one's going to say, oh, you're not supposed to do that, right? The second big change is, I think organizations need to recognize that. So there's this idea I talk about a lot on Tilt the Windmill of the 3 horizons of innovation. So you've obviously heard sustaining versus disruptive innovation. McKinsey talks about Horizon 1, Horizon 2, Horizon 3. Horizon 1 innovation, or sustaining innovation, is about assuming that tomorrow is like today, only more so. And there's this great line by Sergio Zyman from Coca-Cola who says, the definition of marketing is is selling more things to more people for more money, more often, more efficiently. And you can actually make that list, right? Like, show me, how do I sell more things? How do I sell to more people? There's a lot you can do with innovation in just sustaining innovation. Unfortunately, sustaining innovation is not the same as progress. So this is a post I'm working on right now, but freebie preamble. Sustaining innovation often involves innovation to stand still. A great example of this is the Chrysler PT Cruiser. PT Cruiser is a shitty car. Pardon my French. It's an awful car. Nobody wants one. Turns out it was a huge success, right? And it was a huge success because Chrysler didn't build it to make a great car. That car is actually classified as a light truck. Chrysler built the PT Cruiser to lower or to make the average fuel economy of their light truck fleet within compliance of federal emission standards. They didn't care if they sold cars. I mean, yeah, they tried to sell some. They care. And by the way, what they did is they actually sold most of them to rental fleets, which is why there's so many PT Cruisers and rental places. But it brought their average fleet economy down below federal guidelines so they could continue to sell without fines in California and in North America. Was that innovative? Hell yeah. Was it progress? Probably not. And so one of the first things you got to do if you're an entrepreneur in a large organization is realize that innovation may not be progress. You will be called upon to deliver front page and stall the HTML editing market without building a quality product. Are you innovating? Yeah. Is that progress? Absolutely not. And what's tragic about that is that you're creating things that are good for sustaining the existing business. You're not necessarily creating new businesses. And so all the stuff I've seen says that 70% of your organizational effort is spent on sustaining innovation, 20% on adjacent innovation, which is changing the product, changing the market, or I would argue changing the method of delivery and the go-to-market strategy. And 10% is truly disruptive innovation, which is, hoverboards and moonshots, unlikely to succeed, but you got to try. And so for an entrepreneur, they got to, even in their daily job, say, I'm going to do 70% of things the way I was told, 20% I'm going to try one little tweak, and then 10% of my time I'm going to just spend being crazy. And that's a very Zen state, but I think that's the right answer.
Awesome. Hey, so I wanted to welcome everybody to Moves the Needle Lean Lunch. If you guys have any questions, make sure to tweet those to us using the hashtag #LeanLunch. Today we have Alistair Croll from, what's the name of your company again, Alistair?
So me is solve for interesting, but the new project I'm working on is called Tilt the Windmill.
Tilt the Windmill, right. I knew that one. I didn't know if it was solve for interest or solve for interesting.
Yeah, so there's actually, I'll give you a 30-second answer for that, but it's actually a funny story. So there's this brilliant guy, Herbert Simon, he's an economist in the 70s, who says, we don't live in an information economy. People said, what are you, crazy? He said, no, because economies are dictated by what's scarce. So fuel economy, agrarian, land economy, feudal economy, whatever. Information is massively abundant. There's too much of it. What's scarce is the thing information consumes, and what information consumes is your attention. And so we live in an attention economy, and the fact that companies like Google and Facebook, they live on attention. They literally are an exchange rate or an exchange platform that turns attention into money. I believe that when humans are presented with too many things to which they want to pay attention, they tend to focus on whatever's most interesting. And so I think that the right answer in most cases in a modern attention economy is to solve for interesting rather than solving for fame or profit or notoriety or risk. And if you solve for interesting, good things happen. So that's why it's a weird name.
I think it's a cool name. Awesome.
Yeah, Google came out with solve for X like a week after, so it kind of sucked.
That's what you get for being just slightly ahead of the curve.
The worst place to live, yeah.
Right. So we find often that when we're consulting as well, that we find that along the lines of what you were just talking about, that people are asked to sort of either solve incrementally or solve in the H1 space. We do the workshops. People struggle rather desperately with a few different things. One is that they really struggle to come up with frame-breaking ideas because they've sort of been put within the frame as part of their jobs. But they also struggle with what to do when they discover that this idea that's within the frame is garbage. How do they elucidate that in such a way that they can bring management to a point where they're ready to break frame? Do you have thoughts on that?
Well, one of the things that is most dangerous, you talked about what an entrepreneur should do. What an entrepreneur should not do is present a problem without a solution. I have been managing companies with hundreds of people in them, and I had some employees who go, this sucks, we'll all be killed, it'll never work. There's others who go, hey, I thought about this, and we should try these 5 other things because this sucks. Like, guess which one I want to have on my team?
Of course.
So it's easy to say, this idea sucks. In a startup, you can say, this idea sucks, I'm giving the money back, or this idea sucks, I'm going to change the entire business, or this idea sucks, I have to stay up late tonight. You can't do that in a big company, because in a big company you have you have momentum, right? You have existing commitments, customers, contracts, all those kinds of things. And even if your product is selling at a loss, it's cheaper than having no product and idle hands and no revenue. And so a great example of this that's happened recently is the rise of software as a service. There's an organizational inertia because salespeople want to sell physical goods. Those physical goods are nice. When you try to switch to software as a service, you get weird stuff like being able to buy Microsoft Office Live in a box at the Apple Store, which, like, there's 3 reasons that's a strange sentence. But there's a whole bunch of Microsoft reps who are paying for their mortgage with licenses, right? Just the switch from a license model where you pay up front and then there's an annual support fee to the SaaS model is huge. And so if you come in and say SaaS is going to eat everyone's lunch, selling licensed software is stupid, that's not very helpful. If you come in and say, and I have a plan to incrementally get us there, that's very good. I think people underestimate the value of baby steps. Some classic examples of that. Netflix. When Netflix first came out, broadband wasn't available broadly in consumer markets. And so they shipped DVDs in envelopes. Worked great. Blockbuster missed that market completely because Blockbuster was in the business of making money on late fees and running real estate. Netflix had no real estate and no late fees. So as far as their value lens goes, it was a horrible place to be. Meanwhile, Netflix was busy building customer lists and understanding all the problems of the business and understanding what customers wanted, knowing it would launch a web streaming service. It wasn't called Postal Flicks, right? It was called Netflix. So postage was a baby step. Twitter. Everyone forgets that Twitter is 140 characters because SMS is 160 characters, and your Twitter handle is 20 characters. So SMS plus your SMS dictated the size of the Twitter message. And that was a great baby step because at the time that Twitter first emerged, the penetration of smartphones with an installed client was very small. So they had a chicken and egg problem, right? They wanted to get a lot of users, but those users needed a client. Turns out they used SMS. That's a really cool way to run things because SMS running like that is a wonderful way to get penetration very quickly in a tight market like Austin or DC or whatever. All the good companies today figured out the baby steps to get there. Uber, when Uber launched in Seattle, they basically hired all of the town car drivers in Seattle for $30 an hour until those town car drivers were getting more than $30 an hour commission, and they switched them over. They created artificial supply. So every one of the companies that's doing this stuff seems to have like a strategy that involves baby steps to get to the market they want to be in. And this is something that I think most large companies don't think about enough. So if you're going to bring someone a problem like this sucks, I've identified a huge problem in the market, tell me the baby steps to get us somewhere else. And that's a much harder thing to do, but it's hard. Anyone can complain about stuff.
Yeah, I like to tell entrepreneurs, don't confuse the size of the first step with the size of the change you want to make.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. I was reflecting back on something a friend of mine says about bandwidth and Netflix, and he said, at the beginning it didn't matter how much bandwidth anybody had. Nobody has more bandwidth than UPS.
Right.
Right.
There's a Jim Gray quote: "Never underestimate the bandwidth of a station wagon full of hard drives driving down the highway."
Yeah, I love it. So that's awesome. So I think the second half of my question is, what do you think they need to do if they do discover, right? So they have a better solution. How do they bring the enterprise along, especially in the enterprise, to being willing to disregard or discard the sacred cow, or that the golden calf idea that comes from management?
Well, I think the two things. First of all, is you mentioned a cow. We're literally talking about stars, question marks, and cash cows. So the BCG box model talks about this idea. You've got to learn how to milk the cows, but eventually the cows are going to stop producing milk and they turn into steak. Everyone hates that part, right? The sacrificing your cows, but you're going to cannibalize things. And Microsoft's a great example with Office Live. If you wait so long that you don't want to kill Office revenues, then someone like Google shows up with Google Docs. And so you have to recognize that what you're going to do, there's an opportunity cost, and it's very important to analyze the opportunity cost of the incumbents. A more recent example of the innovator's dilemma, one that I think is more on people's minds than the classic example of hard drives that Clay Christensen talked about, is Amazon. So the innovator's dilemma says, if you continue doing more of the same to your existing customers, you're toast, because disruption doesn't come about from new entrants with cool new technology. It comes about from people focusing on a market with a different value proposition. When HP and Dell were selling servers and they asked their customers, what would you like more of? They said, well, I want higher density, better cooling, more MIPS, more racks, more cores per rack, that kind of stuff. Because they were talking to CIOs. If you asked a CIO, if you asked a CTO what they wanted, or a startup what they wanted, what they actually wanted was, I want to pay as I go. I want the ability to spin up and tear down instances. I want a high number of objects stored. I want architectural reliability because I can have a distributed audience rather than one market, and so on and so on. It's a big list, right? If you go to a CIO, like the first Amazon EC2 instance was bad according to every dimension a CIO would ask for. It was more expensive, it was less reliable, it was not properly compliant for governance. Like every single thing about that instance was exactly the opposite of what HP and Dell were being told by CIOs. But Amazon wasn't targeting CIOs. They were targeting startups and CTOs and people who wanted to experiment. Now, the best way to buy a performant or to build up a performant, highly available server is to do it in the cloud and use architecture to create reliability across availability zones with DNS and so on. So all those things the CIOs wanted, actually you get that much better from the cloud. But it wasn't obvious, right?
Yeah.
Every single time you see a company fail to make this transition, they do it too late. They fail to understand the reframing of the business. And so I did this image on Tilt the Windmill about the fact that if you are an innovator, you are a pariah to the organization. I mean, you're by definition, you're a slumlord. You're talking to people nobody wants to talk to. You are a cannibal. You're like encouraging the organization to eat its young. You are a narcissist. You worry a lot about how you're going to get attention. You're a bad listener because you don't take anything your customers say to heart. You usually actually think about the opposite of what they said, right? So every single behavior that you exhibit makes you a pariah. The key is for the organization to understand why you're behaving that way. And that's the hardest part, right? Is like, this is a very foreign behavior. Even Google takes Google X and puts it in another building somewhere where it can't touch the rest of the company.
Yeah, exactly. I think the Office 365 or Office Live is actually an interesting example too of launching a product that was not well received, but in sort of trying to recover from that failure, they did a lot of listening to customers and a lot of looking at behaviors, and now they've managed to create an offering that's compelling enough that I think I just saw that I think it was Los Angeles County, after already having upgraded 12 of their districts or 12 of their divisions to on-site regular Exchange instances, they actually canned that project and is moving everything to Office 365.
Yeah, I mean,
the offering is now compelling.
There's no doubt that the incumbency factor is huge, right? I mean, Microsoft. I remember seeing a screenshot the other day. Like Internet Explorer was 7 menus down in Office in Windows. Like you had to click on Start, then Programs, then Applications, whatever. Like way down there, right? Yeah. This is the Internet buried 5 trees down. Microsoft's a smart company, and they have turned on a dime fast. I mean, even the new ads for the Surface that they're putting out look good. Mm-hmm. Like finally, they figured out what that is, which is some hip-looking guy traveling from meeting to meeting with dance music in the background, being all connected. Yeah. You know, but like he plugs it into the projector and it just works. So if you can execute, you don't have to be first, but you do have to be able to turn on a dime. And I think Microsoft has succeeded in that it's not always first, but it's surprisingly good at turning on a dime.
Yeah, that's great. The other question I had for you is, before Amazon really found their groove with the virtualization market, there were a number of other players in the space that had probably more well-refined, more well-defined, and more robust offerings. What do you think it was about the way Amazon came with it that helped them to become the most dominant player?
So we're gonna first of all, they're a great use case because they can say if it works for Amazon, it'll work for you, right? Like, so first thing is they had the best alpha customer willing to talk, which was them.
Yeah.
But if we're going to nerd out a little bit, so I spent a lot of time. I used to run Cloud Connect and the Enterprise Cloud Summit, so I'm going to nerd out on clouds for a little bit. Amazon introduced S3 before it introduced EC2. S3 is their large object storage. Basically, it's a very simple API. I give you a URL, you give me an object. Or I give you an object, you give me a URL. That's at a simple level, that's what it is, right? Amazon. So there's a concept that a guy named Dave McCrory, who's now the CIO of Basho, came up with called data gravity. Data gravity is this idea that, as I was saying earlier, never underestimate the bandwidth of a station wagon full of hard drives going down the highway. Compared to the cost of moving bits around, everything else is free in computing. Jim Gray, researcher at Microsoft, had done a whole bunch of work on this, and it turns out that compared to the cost of moving bytes around, everything else is virtually free. Because of that, data has gravity, meaning if I have a bunch of data in one place, I'm going to put more of my data near that data because the things I'm going to code to chew on that data will cost more the further apart they are. So you get kind of surface tension where data all wants to be in one place for economic reasons. As a result, Amazon introduced S3, which is its large object store. And it was using it for like book covers and some other stuff. But S3, basically when you upload content, it was free. It's kind of like crack cocaine, right? The first bit is free, or poison. The antidote costs, but you can upload it all you want. And so people would upload stuff in there, and then they wanted ways to chew on what was in that storage. And so the way they chewed on it was EC2. So they first launched S3 and then launched EC2. I think Amazon was the first to realize this. Everyone else was basically selling rented metal Virtualization is not the same as cloud computing. So if I just say to you, you can have a server, but I'll run it for you, that's like managed hosting, big deal. Cloud computing is actually about services. If you go and look at a VMware-based cloud, you have like storage and compute, right? If you go look at Amazon, you have like 50 services. You have CloudFront, and you have management consoles, and you have simple MQ for message queues, simple DB for databases, Redshift, Kinesis. There's tons of services. Same thing with Google. Google has a function you can call in App Engine to rotate images 90 degrees or crop images, like a function. They have a mailing function. They have hundreds of functions. So when you build something on Amazon or on Google, you're standing on the shoulders of giants. And I think Amazon and Google realized what the minimum viable product in that industry was a set of services, not rented metal. And Amazon was the first to really articulate, we have a set of compute services rather than we have some virtual metal you can rent by the hour.
Yeah, that's really cool. I mean, certainly great building blocks for other people to run experiments and so forth.
Right. And I think, there's been a lot of discussion lately about what is disruptive. Well, I think that for me, the test of something disruptive is that it alters other industries. So Google Maps is disruptive not because you can do mapping on Google Maps, but because it allows Uber to break into London. Like if there was no Google Maps or no mapping tool, the knowledge, which is the taxi cab drivers thing where they have to like learn all the streets of London over years, would still be a good barrier to entry for Uber in London. But as soon as Google Maps shows up, that erodes a barrier to entry. So to me, when litmus test for is it disruptive is does it erode an existing barrier to entry in a significant way that changes other industries?
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
I think one of the things that's interesting, however, is that I think that the disruptive side of things is really all of these enterprises' objective, and they need to do it as you've discussed. What I find interesting, though, is that a lot of these enterprises just need lean startup to move faster, and that really there's nothing wrong with taking some of their more sustaining stuff in order to flex their muscles and to figure out how to organize cross-functional teams. I mean, a lot of this stuff. And actually, you brought up GE. GE is a great example. When the at the conference, at Eric's conference last year, they came out with the article, we've been doing lean startup stuff. Here's our new refrigerator. And people actually gave them a hard time saying, well, how is that disruptive? And I'm all like, listen, these guys did stuff new, and they applied the principles, and it was actually a great step to start learning how to apply that sort of thing.
Right. I think lean doesn't have to be about disruption. Lean has to be about incremental improvement. Sometimes the consequence of continuous incremental improvement is like a sea change or tectonic shift, tipping point, right? But it's like chaos theory. They talk about water going down a river, and there's a stone there, and at some point, the speed of the water makes the stone makes bubbles appear in the water. You don't know what that's going to be. There's some tipping point there. This comes back to the three horizons. You need to be able to take away the word lean, call it iterative, experimental thinking, right? Call it innovation, whatever. You need to be able to innovate in the sustaining stuff, which is innovating in the more things to more people for more money, more often, more efficiently. You need to be able to innovate in the disruptive stuff because there you're trying to say, how will the market change, be reframed, what new markets could I be in? Like a truly good example. I love this example of the middle ground stuff, which I call adjacent innovation. We are obsessed in Lean Startup with Ansef's matrix, right? The product market fit, new or existing product, new or existing market. I think that's a trap. I'm a marketing guy, so I take a very broad definition of marketing, but most people think marketing is like Marcom or sales.
Right.
So I actually think you have to innovate on product, on market, and on method. Let me give you an example. I'm going to pick on Amazon again. When Amazon as a bookstore emerged, they were selling the same product, books, to the same market, readers. They just had a new method, and the method they had was digital storefront and concentrated centralized logistics for distribution. Same product, same market, new method. At that point, they were able to introduce the Kindle, which was a new product, sold to the same market, readers, using the same method, web-based storefront. But the Kindle was genuinely a new product. And then because the Kindle came along, people who were legally blind could now read those books where they couldn't before because they could choose very large font sizes and they could use the Kindle to read the book to them. So that's a new market, legally blind. when you are talking about adjacent innovation, which is sort of Horizon 2, and this is a lot of what I've been doing on Tilt the Windmill is, you like how I said Tilt the Windmill? I keep saying Tilt the Windmill. It's a good idea. But a lot of what I've been talking about is this, like, how do you affect these three horizons, right? So Horizon 1 is the sort of Sergio Zyman's 5 mores. Horizon 3 is all the stuff we think about building a startup internally, tends to be isolated, tends to be sort of skunkworksy, tends to be out of the box, tends to be 10% of your resources. But that middle ground of adjacent innovation often lives within the business unit. It doesn't, if it's too centralized, it doesn't get the business unit's issues. It's tasked with finding a new product, a new market, or a new method. So like the Mr. Clean Magic Eraser. That thing was actually aircraft insulation, and then someone noticed it cleaned really well. Some P&G guy in Japan noticed somebody using it as a cleaning product, and they repackaged it as the Mr. Clean Magic Eraser. That's aircraft sound insulation. That's a great example of taking a product in an entirely new market, right? Distributed in a new method. So that's adjacent innovation to me. There's nothing really disruptive about that, but it was an attempt to take that catalog of things and sort of shop it around P&G and actually find a new home for it. So most of what enterprises want to do as innovation is this: how can I change the method, how can I change the product, or how can I change the market? And when you change one of those three, lean methods are excellent for testing those.
Right. So I actually wrote about the in the Lean Entrepreneur because Intuit actually applies that as well, and it's modified and it's a slightly different take in the sense that it's how they organize their internal startups. And so, like you said, the H3s are these these traditional type of startups only inside the enterprise, and the H2s are those startups that have graduated towards improving their business model, rather than the H3s need to, hey, do we have anything at all? Are we delighting our users? We start with what they say is sort of the cohort of one, and then can we have a cohort of people that are passionate about the product? So once you've proven that, you move them into this H2, which is really about proving the business model before you then those that graduate from business. So it's a nice way for our audience to think about how you can actually organize internal teams based upon where they are on the and the key actually and why you're a great one to have on is that traditionally the way companies, even when McKinsey and then Jeffrey Moore actually talked about the three horizons as well, is that the way we measured how to move startups through the organization was based on sort of traditional core business metrics, right? So it's return on investment, and that's a way to kill startups. And so
the choice of metrics on those three horizons is entirely different.
Right.
When I did the lean analytics thing at the Lean Startup Conference last year, and I said to Sarah Milstein, look, I'll do it again, but I want to do it on entrepreneurs. The conclusion was that, and I came up with this big table that sort of compared everybody, sustaining and disruptive, Horizon 1, 2, 3, and all this kind of stuff. And the metrics for sustaining are your traditional business metrics. Did I sell more stuff to more people for more money, more often, more efficiently? The metrics for adjacent markets are, have I discovered what looks like a viable business opportunity that can live within an existing line of business? So, like, can this find a home? And the metrics for the third one are, what have I learned, right? So in the second one, you're sort of like, what assumptions? I have assumptions. What assumptions have I invalidated or validated? Whereas in the third one, it's how much have I learned?
Right.
How many conversations have I had? That kind of stuff. That actually maps pretty well to some of the stuff in lean analytics, where like the fifth stage of growth, which is the scale stage, is very much sustaining, and the first and second, which is like empathy and stickiness, are have I found people and will they do it? Which is right. The early stages. That tends to live in the Horizon 3 stuff.
Great. So we're just about ready to wrap up. Is there any sort of final thoughts you wanted to leave with the audience, Alistair?
Well, I mean, obviously, I'd love to talk to people who are doing innovation in large organizations. I've sort of wondered if I can get the Google Hangouts to do like a cone of silence. Remember those old Tony the Tiger things where he'd sit in darkness and his voice would be changed? Google needs that feature because a lot of the people I talk to are like, yeah, I can't tell you this in a reliable manner. I remember we had a case study for lean analytics that was from the adult industry, and our collaborators, Russian bosses, said, "Well, you will not be publishing this." And so we took that case study out. And it kills me the number of conversations I've had where we can't talk about it. But what I'm enjoying doing is finding these sort of meta patterns. So would love to talk to anybody in large organizations trying to innovate, just to learn how they're doing it, what they're bumping into. And I guess that's about it. I'm doing a lot of stuff on Tilt the Windmill, still trying to figure out if it's going to be a book or a blog or what. So
how do people reach you, Alistair?
Twitter @acroll, and I'm acroll@gmail.com. Leananalyticsbook.com is the website for the book that Ben and I wrote. Tiltthewindmill.com is the new project. There's a mailing list for Tilt the Windmill that people can sign up for, where I'm just sending out these posts and interviews.
Awesome. Nice. Awesome. Well, so thanks so much for being on with us today, Alistair. We look forward to catching up with you again in the future. I'm Seth Webster, and
let's one sec. Sorry to interrupt, Seth. I just wanted to make sure our audience knows that we have some upcoming events from Moves the Needle. So I'm actually taking off for Europe on Tuesday, and we'll be in Luxembourg for the ICT Spring 2014 conference. And then I'll be down in Nice, speaking at the European Innovation Academy, and we'll be in Paris towards the end of the week, July. I'll be there about July 9th or 10th. So if anybody is in that neck of the woods and wants to reach out, please feel free. Or if you want to attend the ICT Spring, that would be awesome. Aaron on July 8th is going to be on the JHTC panel. And I'm not exactly sure how you. We're also heading to Connecticut on the 14th. If you'd like us to speak to your group or want to meet for a cup of coffee, then you should also reach out to us. So, Seth, now back over to you, man.
Yeah, man, I was just no problem. So just wanted to thank everybody for attending today. We will be announcing another Lean Lunch coming soon with some very special guests. And thanks everybody for tuning in today.
Thanks, Alistair.
Thanks, guys.
All right.